Mandatory arrests of abusers in domestic violence situations. Sounds like a no-brainer law. The police show up, bad guy, bad gal gets arrested, the victim's safer, end of story. But in my opinion, after working with hundreds of cases of abusive relationships, is that this policy of mandatory arrests of abusers is a bad policy, and it leads to much more dangerous situations. And bear with me, I'm not saying don't arrest. I'm saying mandatory arrest as a blunt tool that creates these predictable problems that leads to worse situations for victims. And in a few moments, I'll show you 3 detailed reasons why I think it's a bad policy as it stands. And the biggest problem is not what you think it is, and it shows up before the police even arrive. Hey folks, I'm Dr. Jake, and I have a PhD, and my expertise is on relationships, abuse, and parenting. And I've helped hundreds of men and women on personal growth and through the relationship challenges. And I'm not sure why you're here, but I'm glad you're here watching this video. And today we'll be talking about mandatory arrests, what it is, why I think it doesn't work, and what we should be doing instead. And this is not legal advice. I'll be talking about my own professional experience and some of the findings from my research and other scholars who study these patterns as well. So what is mandatory arrest for domestic violence? Long story short, they are policies that require police officers, law enforcement officers, cops, to arrest somebody when responding to an emergency call that's a domestic, intimate partner violence, it's a husband, a wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, people in a romantic relationship, or they were in a romantic relationships and there's some conflict going on. Maybe it's yelling, or maybe it is physical. And so essentially, once this legal threshold is reached, where there's some evidence that this argument, this fight, this disturbance is a domestic one, then it's no longer in the hands of the victim or the survivor. It is now in the control of the cops who are responding to the scene, and they are mandated with this mandatory arrest policies to arrest that primary aggressor and take that person into custody. And this is chiefly different than a discretionary arrest. So in states with discretionary arrests, when a cop shows up to an emergency, they can make the ultimate call whether or not they arrest somebody based on context, based on the evidence. They can say, John Doe, go sleep at a hotel for the night. We'll go from there. And that's discretionary arrest. In mandatory arrest states, they have to arrest that primary aggressor, or they have to arrest whatever their statute tells them to arrest, which is typically one person or the other. And while mandatory arrest does look a little different in each state, it ultimately forces that cop to make that decision in the moment with limited historical context of that relationship of who to arrest, who's the primary aggressor. Now, before we get into some of the chief issues of these mandatory arrest policies, I want to take a step back, give a little historical context. For the 1980s, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, it was treated more as a private matter. And then you had sort of this macro level change of the battered women's movement and the get tough on crime era. And intimate partner violence, or domestics, it became framed now as this criminal legal social problem. And the system's tools for responding to this are more policing, more prosecution, and then more incarceration. And this is what many scholars call a carceral feminist response, which aims to protect women through the criminal justice system, but then it ultimately sits within the growth and consequences of mass incarceration. And since the 1980s, in the last 40 or so years, the most recent review that I could find as of 2026 estimates around 22 states plus Washington, D.C. still have these mandatory arrest policies. In a slightly older review, found 24 states plus Washington, D.C. So according to my review, it looks like states are actually starting to seriously look at these mandatory arrest policies. So enough context. By now you're probably wondering why I and others have issues with these mandatory arrest policies, or maybe you've thought of a few reasons yourself. And for this video, I'm going to highlight 3 key reasons that I stand behind, and there's data behind in terms of why these mandatory arrest policies have issues. Reason number 1, and that is it puts people into a corner. So first and foremost is victims. Victims, when they are in a domestic violence situation, they're not always calling 911 because they want their boyfriend or girlfriend or whomever to be arrested, put in jail. Sometimes they're calling because they want help de-escalating a more minor conflict, or they are creating a paper trail because of a pattern of abuse, or they just want that person removed from the home for the night. And sometimes they are fearful for their life or that of their children because of a really dangerous situation. But irregardless for the reason, in mandatory arrest states, the outcome is always certain, and that is arrest. And so before, calling 911, making that emergency call, the victim has all these fallout ripple effects kind of bouncing around in their head. If I make this call to 911, how is this going to impact my housing, my financial situation, childcare, immigration, retaliation, family pressure, social pressure? And all of these things lead to this sort of all or nothing pressure of, do I make that call or do I delay it until things are really bad, or straight up avoiding it? Or it also can lead to them isolating themselves entirely from help. And on the other side of the coin, it puts abusers into a corner as well. They're in a mandatory arrest state and that 911 call has been made. It's a very existential sort of fear for them as they start thinking, oh, there's going to be jail time, I'm going to lose my job, probation violations, and custody consequences. And what this ultimately does is it creates this sort of sense of desperation for abusers. And they're more likely to block 911 calls, flee the situation, become more controlling or more violent. And I'm not saying that arrest is not appropriate. I'm saying it certainly is in certain circumstances. But what this does, it creates a certain certainty of arrest that isn't necessarily safer for victims. And then other than victims and offenders, mandatory arrest policies also impact the friends, the family members, and the neighbors. Neighbors might overhear a couple fighting and maybe they're arguing. They're not quite sure, but they know in a mandatory arrest state, if they call the police, somebody's going to jail and they might have a kid. There might be a ripple impact on that family because the neighbors called when it wasn't a domestic. Maybe it was just, a game was on and it was getting a little loud. And it might sort of trigger this domino effect of impact that ultimately might lead to the neighbors no longer liking or even seeking revenge against that neighbor who called the police. And lastly, it puts police into a corner as well. It takes away their ability to think outside of the box and creatively solve problems. Where you have people with their stories conflicting, you have injuries with unknown origins, and you have everybody who's upset, and it's really hard to parcel out who is the primary aggressor here. And officers, they have to act. They have to arrest somebody in mandatory arrest states. And even when the victim's pleading with them, don't arrest this person. They have to watch the kids tomorrow. It was a minor argument or fight. The police have to arrest them. And ultimately, it can create this relationship of defensiveness and reactivity between the community and law enforcement, where we know from research, people are less likely to call the police for help. And ultimately, can also lead to dual arrests, where both people are arrested. And here's the paradox. The policy of mandatory arrest is meant to increase safety through making the outcome of a domestic call automatic, arrest. But what it does inadvertently, unintentionally, is it makes that chance of the victim calling for help early when things are just starting to get bad, less. And by the time when they do call, things have become violent. Which brings us to reason number 2, which is that mandatory arrest has actually been linked to an increase in spousal homicide. So for murder by a spouse, one national study estimated that about 6% of men who are murdered by their intimate partner. And for women, 34% of women who are murdered by their intimate partner. And this policy of mandatory arrest is supposed to address this by removing somebody from the situation. But one national study, a different one, looked at states that had discretionary arrest, where the cop can choose when to arrest somebody in a domestic situation. They compared those states, about half the states, to states that had mandatory arrest. They found that the states with more spousal murder, more spousal homicide, were the mandatory arrest states. In other words, it seems like mandatory arrest may have some sort of part to play in the rate of spousal murder. And now I want to be fair here, because this study I just referenced has been debated by some scholars and supported by others. And it's a challenge in research. How do you code these different laws as, discretionary versus mandatory, and how you code those different laws can change the results. So while it's certainly a complicated issue, the point of this video is the fact that there are signals between mandatory arrest and spousal murder should make us look very closely at mandated arrest, as people's lives are literally in question. And lastly, problem number 3, and that is the increase of dual arrest in states with mandatory arrest. So what is dual arrest? Well, dual arrest is a situation where a cop shows up to an emergency domestic violence call, and they're not sure who to arrest because of limited information, or they're not sure whose story is right, who's lying, And so they arrest both people. And when they arrest both people, it seems sort of fair, like they're removing both people from the situation, but it can have serious unintended consequences for victims. And here's why it happens. And this is from my professional experience and from the research. And it's that, cops show up to an emergency domestic violence call. They don't have, again, that breadth of information about the history and the context of that relationship. They're responding to that immediate incident. But in a domestic violence abusive relationship, it's not about who threw the last punch necessarily. It's been who's been using a pattern of physical violence, intimidation, isolation, and fear over time. And these scenes can look like mutual combat, where both people have marks or black eyes, they're talking over each other, their stories are conflicting, but in states with mandatory arrest, the ambiguity is a problem. And a solution for that ambiguity is to arrest both people. And this feels safe for the officer. It feels defensible. It feels like, we did something in that immediate moment when things were really bad. But the consequences for victims can be brutal. Essentially, the dual arrest criminalizes victims for defending themselves, and it makes that victim less likely to call for help in the future. And this can create all kinds of fallout in terms of housing and custody issues. And also, it can give the abuser another tactic. You see, if we get in a fight again, we both might get arrested again. And this isn't just me saying this. There have been several large-scale studies done looking at how dual arrests impact victims and these unattended consequences for mandatory arrest states. And especially so, it's not necessarily on the officers. Officers in studies have also reported they don't have clear guidance. And how do you determine in a domestic violence situation who is the person who's the primary aggressor in that situation versus the primary aggressor throughout the relationship using control patterns against their partner? All right, so we've now covered those three problems that I and others have with mandatory arrest. But what is the alternative? What's my position and that of others who study this stuff is that we keep the mandatory part but take away the arrest part. And instead, we have mandatory safety actions for victims. And what I mean is to ensure that every domestic violence call gets the same baseline lethality screening, meaning is there any stalking involved? Are there threats? Was there any strangulation or hands on the neck? Are things escalating, or is there firearm access? Because these things aren't just details about a domestic violence call, these are signals that increase the chance of spousal homicide. And if that lethality assessment screens high, then the next step is also mandatory. And that is right then and there, handing that victim off to an advocate. Not a pamphlet, not a call this number, not a you should check these things out, a handoff either on the phone, talking to them, or in person with the victim and advocate, while the officers are still on scene, building a safety plan then and there. And then lastly, guns. And as I'm filming this now, there was recently a shooting in Rhode Island of an entire family at a hockey rink. And this is where people often get familiarized who haven't lived through domestic violence, is through these egregious acts of violence, public acts of violence sometimes on the news. And guns obviously create that lethality risk. And I know this one might ruffle some feathers, but research shows that when firearms are present in a highly abusive domestic violence situation, the chance of somebody using that firearm against themselves or another person, it goes up. And some states do have laws that require that judges or law enforcement take away firearms from somebody in a domestic violence situation. But in other states, there are no such laws. So check your local state to determine what your situation is. So overall, that's the lay of the land about mandatory arrest in the US. And it's my position that you can be tough on violence without being simplistic about arrest. And my takeaway from studying this stuff and working in this field for years now is that mandatory arrest in the 1980s was built on good intentions from those early research signals. But now that we have long-term evidence, it's troubling, and the unintended consequences for victims is literally life and death. And it's my opinion that a better response to domestic violence in the US is lethality assessment on the ground right then and there with the victim. It's handing victims off to an advocate right then and there, actively talking on the phone or in person preferably. It's looking seriously at access to firearms to prevent people from harming themselves or others. And then of course a broader public health approach to giving victims more resources and empowering them to reach out for help. And I know this is a messy and thorny topic, so I formally invite you to add a comment. Is there any experience I didn't address that you've had that others might benefit from reading about in the comments? And you are formally invited to subscribe to this channel. I post weekly, reliable, research-informed videos about relationships, abuse, and parenting. And I recently made this video about giving friends advice who are in abusive relationships, so give that one a watch as well. That's all for now, folks. Toodles.